What a magnificent exhibition the ASI has brought to Minneapolis. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to see it and to be here with you today to talk about Karin Larsson and her place in the Nordic Handicraft movement. She turned from painting to handicraft at a crisis moment in Swedish cultural history, a time when many bureaucrats and intellectuals were deeply concerned about two things: disappearing artisanal skills and the quality of life for Sweden's struggling working class families. The time will come when there will be humble but satisfying art in private dwellings and lofty, soul-inspiring art in public places. This excerpt from a lecture by William Morris delivered in 1884 on medieval Gothic art beautifully encapsulates the mission of Carl and Karin Larsson. Morris asserted further that, quote, external beauty is a symbol of a decent and reasonable life, is above all the evidence of joy in labor, in creation. This evidence of people participating in the work of creation is, I feel certain, the condition toward which all progress in civilization has been aiming. Feed this inspiration, and you feed the flame of civilization throughout the world. Extinguish it, and civilization will also die, end quote. This sense of urgency about improving the living conditions of the working class was shared by European artists, intellectuals, and bureaucrats in the second half of the 19th century. After all, throughout human history until the advent of the Industrial Revolution, all household objects were handmade. Their creators were concerned first and foremost with utility, but in their leisure time, they instinctively embellished them according to inherited traditions and personal inspiration. Karin was one generation away from this age-old practice, which vanished as peasants became wage slaves. Forced to work long hours under often inhuman conditions, whether as domestic servants, miners, seasonal agricultural workers, or shift workers in factories, individuals no longer had the time nor the space to exercise their creativity in the production of household objects. The crowded urban hovels in which they lived had no room for spinning wheels, looms, or workbenches. Today, I'd like to begin by talking about the historical background to Karin's shift from painting to handicraft in the 1890s. It wasn't, as some have asserted, a response to a domineering husband or preoccupation with raising a large family. The circumstances that prompted Karin's decision included a long history of relative gender equality in Sweden and a deepening concern in the 19th century, first on the part of intellectuals and later on the part of politicians and bureaucrats, to create a generic national identity that transcended differences in geography, gender, and social class. Fundamental to this mission was the preservation of artisanal skills and the design of home environments, because Carl and Karin, like William Morris and many other intellectuals at the time, understood the importance of affect, how one's environment impacts the development of one's values, habits, and psycho-emotional well-being. For this reason, interior design became a subject charged with social and political significance. After all, the welfare of society was at stake. In response, Morris, a social activist as well as an artist, designer, novelist, and poet, established a decorative arts company in London in 1861. His goal was to replace the poor quality and ugly mass-produced home furnishings through the restoration of hand craftsmanship. But Morris's desperate desire to improve working class lives was impossible in mid-19th century England. The urban poor had neither the leisure time nor adequate space or training to produce beautiful and utilitarian objects for their own use. Fortunately, in Sweden, the struggle to achieve improved working and living conditions went hand in hand with the handicraft revival. After several decades of concerted effort, this resulted in the realization, to a greater degree than was possible in England, empowered citizens living and working under humane conditions with both the will and the means to create beautiful, if modest, homes. It was the aspiration to make this goal easier to achieve that motivated Ingvar Kamprad to translate these values to industrial production when he established IKEA in 1943. So, what was different in Sweden? Well, for many centuries, men and women in Sweden lived more or less separate lives. This heritage made gender parity far less of a contested issue in Sweden than elsewhere. In fact, in 1859, Swedish women acquired the right to buy property, a right that wasn't granted in the United States until 1974. That's right, 1974. Historically, in Swedish coastal villages, male inhabitants were absent on fishing expeditions for months, even years at a time, leaving village management and governance largely to women. Inland, men spent winters logging the forests, since it was easiest to drag logs out on horse-drawn sleds in the winter, when snow covered the underbrush. During this time, women remained in their villages, attending to feeding, clothing, and sheltering their families and livestock. As is still the case in places like Canada and Russia, men returned home periodically, usually at 6-week intervals. In late spring, when the snow thawed and men returned for the agricultural season, the women took the children and animals to high pastures, fäbod, where they stayed for months. Thus, historically, Swedish men and women lived semi-independent lives in which trust in the competency of the other was essential for survival. In the early 19th century, Swedish intellectuals began to witness the debilitating effects of the Industrial Revolution on both individuals and on long-standing bonds of social cohesion. This led to Gothicism, a movement headed by Erik Gustav Geijer, a history professor at Uppsala University, as well as a poet and composer. The name of the movement had nothing to do with either Goths or the medieval Gothic period, but rather with the non-indigenous Germanic tribes that first crossed the Baltic Sea to settle in southern Sweden during the early centuries of the Christian era, and giving their names to the provinces of East and West Gothland, Öster and Västergötland, and the island of Gotland off Sweden's east coast. In 1811, Geijer founded the Gothic Association, which included influential priests, professors, bureaucrats, and politicians. According to Geijer, every folk lives not only in the present, but also in its memories. Every generation propagates its customs and ideas. This tradition that continues from one generation to another unifies a people, fostering their unbroken consciousness of themselves as a nation. It transmits to them their collective personality. It was this concern that prompted August Strindberg, a painter and historian as well as a dramatist, to write The Swedish People in War and Peace, at Home and Abroad, or 1,000 Years of Swedish Education and Customs, published in 2 volumes in 1881 and 82, with illustrations by Karin Larsson. It was the first history of Sweden to focus on the lives of everyday people rather than on the heroic deeds of great men. This egalitarian and democratic impulse escalated in subsequent decades and found political expression in the Social Democratic Party, established in 1889, and which governed Sweden from the 1930s to the 1970s. By the late 1860s, when Karin began school, Gothicism's patriotic values had permeated Swedish culture because they formed the basis of the national curriculum taught during the 7 years of compulsory schooling required of boys and girls beginning in 1842. The urgency of educating a nation of patriots seemed particularly acute in the second half of the 19th century because the industrialization and urbanization that impacted Western Europe beginning in the late 18th century was telescoped in Sweden into a few intense decades and seemed to many a threat to the very foundations of Swedish society. With the population explosion and intensive industrialization beginning in mid-century, rural social and familial structures began to crumble. As traditional village life dissolved, many rural inhabitants sought employment in towns and cities, and their identities, earlier defined by their village communities, were unmoored by tumultuous economic and social upheaval. They felt stripped of their personal and local identities. Many, as you know, emigrated. This demographic shift and the horrendous living and working conditions now suffered by once self-sufficient peasants worried Swedish intellectuals and bureaucrats, who rightly perceived it as psychologically traumatizing and socially, not to say politically, destabilizing. Artur Hazelius, founder of the world's first open-air museum, Skansen, participated in formulating the curriculum and producing school books. By requiring all Swedish children to use the same books, whether they lived in the snowy forests of Lapland, on the rocky west coast of Bohuslän, or on the fertile plains of Skåne in the south, the Swedish government provided the common ground essential for creating a generic national identity that was intended to fill the psycho-emotional void left by demographic transformation. These illustrated books emphasized Swedish history, geography, and literature, as well as regionally specific traditions in the various parts of this long, narrow, and sparsely populated country. The national romantic ideas guiding this project were expressed by the quote on its cover. "Listen to the whisper of the pines, beside whose roots your home is anchored." In 1872, Hazelius visited the central Swedish province of Dalarna, where he collected many beautifully decorated utilitarian objects and costumes. A year later, he opened a small ethnographic museum in Stockholm that displayed tableaus populated by wax figures wearing dress appropriate to specific locations and occupations, along with typical objects. Anders Zorn's fiancée, Emma Lam, worked there and later established and funded a handicraft school in Zorn's hometown of Mora. In 1880, Hazelius established the Nordic Museum in Stockholm in order to share with the public his growing collection of material culture. He also bought land on the Djurgården hill that lies closest to downtown Stockholm, with the idea of constructing a Sweden in miniature. 5 years later, he purchased his first timber building, the Mora Cottage, built during the 18th century in a Dalarna village near Mora. Eventually, Skansen, which opened in 1891, included buildings from most of Sweden's 20 provinces, from the northern huts of indigenous Sami to a thatched roof farmstead from Skåne, a nobleman's manor house from Småland, even an 18th century pavilion once gracing the garden of the scientist, philosopher, and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Skansen played a vital role in exhibiting Sweden's diversity and celebrating its creative and collaborative peasant past. It embodied the egalitarian, social democratic ideas promoted by progressive Swedish bureaucrats and intellectuals in the 19th century. Not only were buildings authentic and representative, but each was furnished with appropriate decor, objects, even animals, where the various regional approaches to handicraft could be studied. Instead of guards, Hazelius installed knowledgeable guides in all its buildings. Even today, they often hail from the same places as the buildings in which they work and provide authenticity through their various dialects, local wisdom, appropriate folk costumes, and artisanal skills in birch weaving, lace making, glass blowing, cooking, gardening, and animal husbandry. Visitors, then as now, might learn to card or spin wool, bake bread in a wood-fired oven, knit using handmade needles, or make brooms from tree branches. Skansen reflected both the cultural values of national romanticism and the political ideals of social democracy. It promoted understanding of regional, class, and temporal differences, as well as an appreciation of cultural similarities. Visitors observe that regional disparities are of degree rather than of kind. By bringing cultural traditions alive, Skansen provides its audience with a psycho-emotional link to Sweden, its history, and its people. The year after Skansen opened, Swedish poet Gustav af Geijerstam confessed, quote, "This exhibition of old Swedish life affected me like a dream, like a great popular poem set in reality. It is the Swedish people's differences that make such a vivid impression when one goes for a walk through this park." End quote. By 1850, domestic craft activity began to stagnate due to the growing cohort of urban poor suffering under cramped living conditions and long working hours. As a result, these Swedes were those most dependent on mass-produced clothing and utilitarian objects. This unprecedented situation raised concern about the loss of artisanal skills and the deplorable conditions under which so many Swedes now lived, leading in 1845 to the establishment of the Svensk Slöjdförening, the Swedish Handicraft Association. Its mission was to ensure the preservation of technical skills, and to this end, it established a school in Stockholm in 1860. Women, especially, mobilized in the struggle for social justice. Not only did they organize to address these issues, but also to achieve legal parity for women. To this end, Sophie Leonhufvud Adelsparre and Rosalie Roos Olivkrona, both girls from wealthy families, founded Tidskrift för hemmet, or Journal for the Home, or Ladies' Home Journal, in 1859. Its objective was to discuss the, quote, upbringing and activities of women, their responsibilities to home and society, their rights and obligation to work, end quote. It addressed the condition of women in all of the Nordic countries and contained articles such as Women and the Defense of the Homeland and The Power of Women. In 1874, Adelsparre, along with 24 other women, founded Handarbetets Vänner, the Friends of Handicraft, whose dual mission was to preserve traditions and to provide women with a means of earning their own livelihoods. By 1887, Friends of Handicraft was a well-organized entrepreneurial association that offered classes in artisanal textile skills, negotiated commissions for public buildings, and ran a growing number of shops. Another organization with similar goals, Förening för Svensk Hemslöjd, the Association for Swedish Handicraft, was founded by Lilly Zickerman in 1899. These and a handful of other handicraft groups joined forces to create Svenska Hemslöjdföreningarnas Riksförbund, the National Swedish Union of Handicraft Associations, in 1912, which nurtured the diverse traditions in weaving, lace-making, and embroidery that characterized Sweden's 20 provinces. Similar organizational activities were afoot in both Finland, governed at the time by Russia, and Norway, ruled by Sweden. In 1882, Karin met Carl in the Nordic artists' colony of Grey-sur-Loing, situated on a lazy river 50 miles southeast of Paris. They fell in love and married in Stockholm in 1883. In 1885, the Göteborg banker and art collector Pontus Furstenberg began to purchase Carl's paintings, and Carl and Karin became frequent house guests. Furstenberg was an art lover who dreamed of establishing a progressive art school in his hometown as an alternative to the stuffy, rigid Royal Academy in Stockholm. In 1886, he hired Carl as its teacher at a time when the couple was still spending much of their time in Paris. They returned more or less permanently to Sweden following the Paris World's Fair in 1889, where the triptych Furstenberg had commissioned by Larsson that represented the Renaissance, Rococo, and modern art had been a huge critical success. When they returned, Hedda Kay, principal of a newly established school for girls in Göteborg, asked Furstenberg if he'd pay for the decoration of the school's foyer and stairwell. He agreed immediately and hired Carl to execute a design, which the artist completed during an intensive 6 months in the fall and winter of 1890 and 91. Undoubtedly in collaboration with Hedda and Karin, he proposed the subject of the Swedish woman through the ages. His program included scenes depicting women engaged in representative activities from the Stone, Bronze, and Viking ages, followed by images of key historical figures such as Saint Bridget and the founder of Sweden's women's movement, Fredrika Bremer. The scenes were intended to inspire young girls who studied there. Significantly, Hedda Kay was a sister of the influential feminist and teacher Ellen Kay. Kay's ideas about gender equality and the necessity of wholesome environments to the development of a healthy and empathetic society, especially for children, were hugely influential far beyond Swedish borders. She and other experts in childhood development emphasized the importance of freedom, fresh air, and creativity, conditions the Larssons began to create at their new country residence, Lilla Hyttnes, located in the central Swedish village of Sundborn in Dalarna. Significantly, the first chapter of Ellen Kay's widely read book, Beauty for All, often translated as The Year of the Child, was titled Beauty in the Home. There, she anticipated the American architect Louis Sullivan's famous assertion that form should follow function. In other words, chairs should be comfortable and tables the right size and height for those who sit at them. A home should reflect the lifestyle and taste of those who inhabit it. This conviction the Larssons put into action when Karin was gifted the log cottage owned by her spinster aunts in 1888. The Larsson family spent only summers there until 1901, when it became their full-time residence. Karin came honestly by her interest in architecture and design. In 1887, her parents hired the Art Nouveau architect Ferdinand Boberg to design their new home in the rail transportation hub Hallsberg, where Karin grew up. As if in anticipation of her future path, and before she began her studies in painting, Karin attended Stockholm's School of Arts and Crafts, where she would have learned the fundamentals of spinning, dyeing, weaving, and textile design. One can imagine that during her time in Stockholm, she also visited Hazelius's Nordic Museum and, once it opened, Skansen. One can imagine also that her ambition and her desire to overcome the era's limitations placed on affluent women stimulated her urge to become a painter and to join the large cohort of Nordic female artists studying and working in Paris during the 1880s. Karin likely became increasingly attracted to artisanal practice as it became valued as an integral part of the national patrimony and recognized as a utilitarian tool in promoting healthy and happy individuals. It might also have appealed because engaging in artisanal labor was far easier with a half-dozen children running around the house than was oil painting, as Karl made clear in several of his caricatures. In addition, a burgeoning body of literature that recognized the affective importance of handicraft gave it a status it had never before enjoyed. This was evidenced by the eager engagement of men in this activity. Even Karl designed a tapestry, Venus and Thumbelina, woven by Handarbetets Vänner and exhibited in Stockholm in 1909. His pupil and assistant, Gustav Fjestad, founder of the Rockstad Artists Colony in Arvika, also expanded his activities to furniture and tapestry design, as did the Finn Axel Gallen-Kallela and the Norwegian Gerhard Munthe. A half-dozen of Munthe's tapestry designs, always woven by women, will be shown in the Scandinavian Home exhibition opening next September at the Frick Museum in Pittsburgh. The fact that the Larssons subscribed to The Studio, an English design journal published monthly beginning in 1893, as well as to several other Nordic and German design periodicals, substantiates their serious interest in international design trends. A more personal link to England was established in 1893 when Karin's younger sister Stina met the English geologist Francis Arthur Bather, whom she married in 1896 and with whom she moved to London. The studio included reviews of art and design exhibitions throughout Europe and even sponsored competitions for the beautiful design of workers' housing and utilitarian objects. In an article entitled The 20th Century Home, published in 1900 in the popular annual journal Norrnön, the feminist activist and poet Helena Nyblom, a friend of the Larssons, predicted healthy developments in Swedish behavior and design, ones predicated on a return to the past. "There was a time," she began, "when most things were made at home. People wove and baked. Women of the household oversaw the harvest in orchard and garden. It was a time when people celebrated all family events with music, recitations, and costume parties. Activities focused on the home and a small circle of friends, and daily life was described in poetry. People read aloud after dinner, a practice in the Larsson home also, and on winter evenings. Families gathered before the fire to hear Grandma and Grandpa read aloud or tell tales of earlier times. In homes across the centuries, with their few and simple pieces of furniture, people lived incredibly satisfying and meaningful lives. End quote. Nyblom then echoed the assertion made by Carl in his introduction to A Home, first published in 1899. Quote, "The rooms in which one lives should be light and airy for the sake of health. And to make rules for how a home should look is about as stupid as enforcing rules as to how a person should look. A home should be an expression of the personalities of its inhabitants. It should be, above all, functional and easy to maintain. It should also be beautiful." End quote. In her move to abstraction in the 1890s, Karin was not alone. Another pioneering artist, Hilma af Klint, pursued a similar trajectory. This observational realism, like Karin in the 1880s, Hilma painted as she was trained. This observational realism was the conservative norm taught in art academies and the standard according to which submissions to government-sponsored exhibitions were judged. Women, even more than men, were eager to conform in order to achieve success. Non-conforming men were judged as either geniuses ahead of their time or insane. Non-conforming women were more likely to be judged incompetent or insane, a diagnosis that had sinister consequences for women. For these reasons, both Karin and Hilma initially proved their competency according to traditional standards, but they clearly couldn't keep their innovative temperaments suppressed forever. Karin, under the influence of National Romanticism, the handicraft revival, and social democratic ideology, turned to furniture and textile design and production. Hilma, inspired by the spiritual principles of theosophy and the directives of a spiritual being who visited her, a situation she recognized as socially dangerous, continued as a painter, but hid away her abstract works for decades after her death. She undoubtedly worried that she might meet a fate similar to that of the French sculptor Camille Claudel, whose brother Paul, as soon as their father died in 1913, sent Camille to an asylum where she died in 1943, despite the pleas of Camille and her doctors to set her free. Women in most of the Western world at that point were legally considered chattel, property, like livestock and furniture, and their freedom depended on the whims of the men who owned them. First fathers, then husbands or brothers. Late 19th century France witnessed an explosion in the number of women joining convents in order to be free of male control. And in places like Sweden, where women had more civil rights, they often, like Hilma, remained unmarried. In July 1905, the Studio published an article reporting on recent developments in the Swedish textile arts. The author, Axel Tallberg, noted a trend toward, quote, "noble simplicity in form and color," close quote, in modern Swedish textiles. Unfortunately, all the article's illustrations are in black and white. He noted the great regional variations in technique, materials, mainly wool and linen, and design, ones that varied little over the centuries and made identifying the region where a textile was produced relatively straightforward. He noted the encouragement of innovative design evident in the numerous textile exhibitions in cities, towns, and villages. The women of Sweden, old and young, are making intelligent and skillful use of the modern designs provided by our artists and schools, and the numerous textile societies share the common objective of furthering these charming arts, which always brighten and gladden our homes. Thalberg noted the influence of the many historical examples of textiles displayed at Hazelius's Nordic Museum, and noted that several thousand artisans belonged to the recently established handicraft societies, which also received support from national and local governments and privately from the royal family and the bourgeoisie. Prince Eugen, the youngest son of the reigning king and a frequent guest of the Larssons in Sundborn and the Sorens in Mora, was then chair of the Förening för Svensk Hemslöjd's board of directors. He also hired Boberg to design his home, was a very close friend of Helena Neublom, to whom he gifted a version of his famous painting, The Cloud, which wound up in a Florida auction house a dozen or so years ago, and modeled for Richard Berg's famous painting, Nordic Summer Evening. Thalberg attested to the frequent and numerous textile exhibitions throughout Sweden and the importance played by handicraft organizations in furnishing patterns and instructions to their members free of charge. These organizations, quote, use every opportunity to conduct the evolution from the tasteless tendencies of the recent past, when many embraced foreign and factory-produced textiles, into the safe and desirable channels that led to future production, end quote. Karin Larsson was one of the pioneers of this initiative. If you're interested in following developments in the preparation of the upcoming exhibition, The Scandinavian Home, Art and Identity 1880 to 1920, please follow the Instagram account @HomeIsHistory. And if you're interested in learning more about Scandinavian art, subscribe to my YouTube channel launching November 1st, Art History with Michelle. And if you're interested in more of my books, lectures, and articles, as well as blog posts, check out my website, www.michellefacos.com. Thank you so much for your attention. Tack så mycket.